Hello and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. We have a very special episode for you today, so stick around. Today we have with us Ian Evans. Ian has raced pigeons since the age of 9 and is now 48. He is the current secretary of his local club, Rumney Valley. From 2016 to 2022, Ian was the appointed general manager of the Royal Pigeon Racing Association, which the role later became the CEO. He has won many awards. In 2023, he achieved his life ambition of winning a Welsh national race. Most of his family has raced pigeons, including his father, uncles, and cousins who all race. And Ian, thanks for coming on and talking with us today.
Yeah, I'm pleased to be on, and thank you for the invitation, Philip. It's great.
And so I see you got history with your family racing pigeons, and I'm curious as to, was that what got you going into it, just being around it, or what really sparked your interest in racing pigeons?
From as far back as I can remember, racing pigeons has always been a part of my life, really. There was always a pigeon loft in the back garden when my father used to race. And I can remember very, very, very early on, from probably the age of 3 or 4, being taken in the pigeon loft. So that was my introduction. And as I got a little bit older, up to probably about the age of 7, became more and more interested in looking after how to look after the pigeons and what was involved in racing them. And then at the age of 9, we moved address, and my father went in partnership with one of his lifelong friends, and raced from the friend's garden, which meant there was a spare loft in the garden at our home, which I took over from the age of 9. So, I mean, it's been in our family. I think my father started when he was probably younger than me, just a year or two younger than me. He was the first one, really, but my grandfather then took up the sport. One of my father's brothers, my mother's brother, he also races pigeons. And currently I have 2 cousins on my mother's side, which also race pigeons. So it's, I suppose I had no choice, really. But I think you have to have that kind of interest, obviously, because my son has been around racing pigeons all his life. He's now 21, and he has no interest. But I think that kind of animal husbandry has always been something I've been interested in. Probably suits my character, and so, being around the pigeons on a daily basis, I suppose it was something I just naturally took up then.
Any of those family members in the same racing club with you? You guys get to compete against each other at all?
Both cousins at one time, father, myself, and another uncle were all in the same club. I remember I was probably 12 or 13 years of age the first time I beat my father. I remember taking great pleasure in that. I don't think my father was too pleased at the time, but obviously he later come around to the idea.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a big win.
Yeah.
So can you talk about how did you come into the role of being the CEO of the combine?
Yeah. So in the UK, obviously we have the Royal Pigeon Racing Association, which is, I want to use the word governing body loosely, because it's not really it's a kind of association of clubs and individuals, really, but it is the kind of premier organization in the UK, and really puts in place the structure for pigeon racing in the UK, and has done since, I think it was the late 1890s, when it was formed as the National Pigeon Union at the time. It later received royal patronage in the 1970s. Because obviously Queen Elizabeth, her father and grandfathers, and now King Charles, all raced pigeons. The Queen herself was the patron of the Royal Pigeon Racing Association. How I came to work for the RPRA, I'd done a number of jobs locally, really, in the local racing federations and the club. And I always had an interest in the administrative side of the sport, as well as the competitive side of it. At the time, I was working for the local government in my area, managing a project. I think it was worth £13 million at the time. And that was coming to an end. I'd worked with them for 20 odd years at the time. The post of general manager, as he was at the time, was advertised in the British Homing World, which is a national publication, weekly publication in the UK, which the RPRA, the Royal Pigeon Racing Association, also own. And I just thought, you know what, I'll have a go at it, not thinking I had any chance really of getting it. I mean, traditionally, the job has always gone to probably people who have come out of the armed forces, a major so-and-so's usually been the general manager or whatever. So I come from a kind of coal mining community in South Wales. But nevertheless, I thought I had the relevant skills for the job. So I threw my hat into the ring, produced a CV, which I'd never done in my life, completed an application form and sent it in. I always remember going to the interview, and the president and the vice presidents of the association were interviewing all the prospective candidates. And I was really, really critical of the RPRA from the point of view of, because, I always feel it's important to be honest. And I felt they had some frustrations with the RPRA. Although the RPRA has always done really good things for the pigeon sport, it could do a whole lot more. I voiced those kind of feelings in the interview, so thought, there's no way I'm going to get this job. By the time I drove home, which was about a two-hour drive, I was getting a phone call to say they'd like to offer me the job. So I then had a decision to make, which obviously I decided to take the plunge and was in the role for just over 6 years, or just under 6 years, I think it was.
And so, with some of the issues that you had with them, were you able to make some changes, implement some of your ideas?
Yeah, well, I think my frustrations were twofold, really. I think the kind of structure of pigeon racing in the UK has been, it's a mishmash of kind of rules and traditions which have happened over 100 years. There's no real kind of strategic direction with it, and still isn't to this day, which perhaps we'll touch upon later on, in my opinion, anyway. And the other thing was more about promoting the sport and encouraging more and more participation, because I think in the 1980s, the RPRA had 60,000 members. And it's important to note that, there are other kind of organizations in the UK apart from the RPRA, which provide the structure of pigeon racing. But the RPRA has always and still remains by far the largest organization. So even though the RPRA had 60,000 members, I think, there was probably more like 80,000 in the UK at the time, with 20,000 probably members of other organizations. Before that time, the membership was probably even greater, but for some peculiar reason, they didn't keep records of what the membership was prior to the 1980s. So you had 60,000 members in the 1980s.
60,000 members. That's a lot of members.
Yeah, yeah. As I say, when I took over, those 60,000 members were in the 1980s. By the time I took over, I think it was around 23,000 members. So you can see whether there was that consistent decline, really. And one of my frustrations was that I felt the RPRA should be doing more to promote the sport and encourage people to take it up. And so that was something I was keen to implement through my role with the RPRA. But I need to point out to your listeners who are perhaps not familiar with the structure in the UK, even though I was general manager and later CEO of the organization, in reality, the kind of decision-making powers I had were very, very limited, because every decision had to be endorsed by the RPRA Council, which is basically the RPRA board. And it's made up of, at the time, it was 20, I think it was 22 members of council, which were all elected by 13 regions of the RPRA, 13 regions throughout the UK. And I think it's fair to say that not everybody on that council, or perhaps the majority on that council, didn't feel there was a need to promote the sport, and were just willing to accept the decline, which was something, as a pigeon fancier and somebody who's passionate about the sport and knows what it has to offer, wasn't something I was willing to accept. I wrote a project idea in terms of how we could allocate a relatively small budget to a project to test it out and basically take the sport to the people, rather, because what you'll find in the UK, and I'm not sure if this is the same in the States, is that probably 99% of the population don't even know pigeon racing exists. And those who know it exists probably have a very limited understanding of what's involved. And then a lot of them have a negative viewpoint as well. It was about taking the sport out to people rather than waiting for people to come to us and just sit there and accept the fact that the membership and participation in the UK was declining. We put out the job of a kind of development officer, which wasn't a development officer in the traditional sense. It was more about promoting the sport, which was a part-time job to start with. And we were lucky to, we had some great candidates, to be fair, but one stood out, a gentleman by the name of Richard Chambers, who at the time was relatively young, in his early 30s, I think Richard was, or maybe late 20s, fourth generation pigeon fancier, worked in a school and had set up a school loft in the Midlands of the UK. And that was kind of the blueprint of what we followed, because that was a really successful project and introduced hundreds and hundreds of pupils to the sport of pigeon racing, and their parents, by the way. And as a result of that, some of those children did take up the pigeon sport in their own right, outside of the school loft. So we had a kind of blueprint of what could be done in terms of introducing this sport to younger people. And we also had a kind of an Ofsted report, which is like, the Ofsted is like the organisation in the UK that assesses schools' performances. And when the Ofsted reports, they'd identified this project as best practice in terms of engaging pupils who perhaps have behavioural issues or learning difficulties. and how it improved their attendance at school in the first instance, their behaviour, and also the grades they were achieving in terms of, the fact that this pigeon project was then built into subjects like science, maths, geography, history, and obviously because they had a real interest in the pigeons, they were really engaged in it, and their grades increased and improved as a result of it. So we started rolling this project out, and I think by the time we came to the pandemic, when the world seemed to stop in 2020, I think we had eight school lofts around the country, all of which were very successful. We were very disappointed when COVID hit because everything stopped. We just started gaining momentum where more and more schools were getting interested in it, and Richard was going out and talking to them about what the project involves, what the benefits of the school were, how it would work. All that stopped overnight, really. All our momentum sadly went. But that's the kind of thing we were looking at doing, and that's the kind of thing we were successful in introducing, which that kind of promotion of the sport on that scale probably had never ever been done.
Those lofts at the schools, are they going up again now, or did they stop entirely?
After COVID, when we started coming out of the lockdown period and moving into when I left in 2022, I think there was still 6 of the lofts operating and actually actively racing. I'm not sure how many of them are still racing today, but since I've left, the RPRA have removed the project and the funding for the project, so it doesn't exist any longer, which was really frustrating.
So it's kind of just up to the schools then to keep the lofts going.
Yeah, basically, in some instances we had, well, I think in all the instances actually, we were able to identify a local pigeon fancier as a mentor and somebody to help them look after the pigeons. So they probably, some of them might still be operating, and those people are still supporting the school as often as they can.
That's a great idea. There's actually a school in California that has a pigeon loft, and it was like you were saying, the math, the history, engineering, making the loft. There's so much things that the kids can be learning through the racing pigeons, and they do compete with a race club in California,
Yeah,
and same thing, especially kids with attendance issues and stuff like that. Like,
yeah.
grades went up, attendance went up. It was really, really cool to see. So, no, that's a brilliant way to promote it.
Yeah, and obviously Richard was well, if you ever met, perhaps Richard is somebody who should approach really for your podcast. He's a really kind of really enthusiastic guy when it comes to the pigeon sport, and had some great ideas in terms of, I mean, that promotion throughout the school was just the tip of the iceberg really in terms of what Richard had planned. But as I say, COVID first of all scuppered it, and then obviously the feelings of the RPRA council stroke board, been such that they've had other financial challenges which they've tried to address, and obviously this was one of the first things to go. Which, in my opinion, this is the last thing that should go, because these kind of projects is what's going to secure the future of the sport in the UK. And without taking it to people, it has no future, unfortunately, in my opinion. As hard as that is to say, so I think it's a little short-sighted, really, and I think there is a vacuum that here in the UK for an organisation to step in and perhaps take up this on behalf of everybody, really.
Even like you're saying, you created this role, like as you call them development or a promotional,
Yeah,
role like that, to actually get out there. And I'm a little surprised, I guess I would, here in the States, yeah, it's totally either you don't know this pigeon world exists, or if you're in it deep. There's no like, oh yeah, I know about it, but that's it. It's, I would really assume that where you guys are, just because your history is so much deeper with pigeon racing there, that everybody kind of knew about pigeon racing. I'm surprised at that.
yeah, and I think if we'd had this conversation probably back in the 80s, that probably would have been the case, because I don't know if this kind of viewpoint is correct, but the way I think about it is, I mean, growing up in a mining community in South Wales, the focal point was really the local social club. The pigeon club was at the social club. So you had a kind of shop window, really, in some respects, where all the community went to this one particular club on the weekend. And that's exactly where the pigeon club was. So everybody knew, to a certain degree, something about pigeon racing, or somebody in a family raced pigeons. So they had some kind of understanding of it. But sadly, with the changes in society, really, in the UK, which is, I'm sure is the same in the States, that kind of social aspect of the communities and the social clubs is something that has gone to a certain degree. And so you haven't got that shop window. And then so when a new generation come along who've never been exposed to it, why would they know anything about it? Because it is a sport which, unlike like football or something which is on the TV, or something you can go and watch. You can't go and watch a pigeon race. Well, you can to a certain degree, but you can't watch the full process of it, really, can you? Not spectate the sport.
Maybe over there, what do you think the biggest misconception about pigeon racing is?
The fact is that there is no misconception in the large majority of cases because they don't exist. But I think, those who do know it exists really don't understand what's involved. And throughout my kind of work in life, whenever I've been in an office environment and people have said, "Oh, what are you going to do on the weekend?" And I say, "Oh, race my pigeons." I say, "What do you mean race your pigeons?" So you start explaining to them, what's involved. People are really, really interested. It does change their opinion of those who knew a little bit about it will ask questions which to me seem silly, but obviously they seem silly to me because I've been around pigeon racing all my life. But if you're somebody who's never been exposed to it, it's not a silly question. I mean, they ask things like, "Well, how do the birds know where to go?" And I say, "Well, they fly home." They say, "Yeah, but how do they know where to go to the race?" So they think they fly to the liberation site. And then you obviously explain to them the process of race marking and getting them to the liberation site, which is the starting line. So there's loads of misconceptions out there, and I think generally people have got a totally wrong opinion of pigeons because they probably base their opinion on the pigeons they see in the cities, the feral pigeons, etc. So changing that perception is quite difficult. It's difficult, but once you sit people down, explain to them, they really do get it. I mean, they quite quickly pick it up.
And the RPRA, that was also the Royal Loft flies in that organization, right?
Yeah. The Royal Loft was in Sandringham. The time I was there, the Royal Loft manager was a gentleman by the name of Peter Farrow, who I think is still the Royal Loft manager. He lives on the Sandringham estate, looks after the pigeons. I know Her Majesty used to take a real interest in the pigeons and visit there regularly. I'm not don't know so much about King Charles because obviously not in that kind of circle any longer. But I know Queen Elizabeth definitely had a real interest in it.
Yeah, you always see the pictures of her with her pigeons, and yeah, I've heard stories that she would go there pretty frequently.
Yeah, yeah.
Does the Royal Loft still fly?
Yeah, they still racing. They race in, I think it's the King's Lynn Club in Norfolk, which is obviously a local area for Sandringham. So yeah, they still racing. Yeah.
Let's talk about when the UK left the EU and how that affected the racing and doing the releases.
Yeah, and I mean it's something that perhaps when people were voting to leave the European Union under Brexit, as it was known in this country, something that probably never crossed their minds, especially many pigeon fanciers who I think would have voted for Brexit, in terms of how that would impact our tradition of racing pigeons from the European continent, and in vast majority of cases France, which we'd been doing successfully for well over 100 years. So obviously the pigeons were taken across on a ferry across the English Channel into France and liberated at all different points in France to fly back across the English Channel into the UK. And they were perhaps the races that carry the most prestigious kind of awards in the UK. And when we left the European Union, all of a sudden we were subjected to all different animal health conditions and controls if we wanted to move our pigeons into France. And something which obviously we couldn't meet. The regulations they put in place at the time were actually impossible. And without going into too much detail, it required a blood test of all the birds a couple of days before you moved them. The vet to be present in the loft before you moved them. Each and every loft would have to have a blood test and have a vet present. So obviously that was absolutely impossible, and it's something that kind of we had to lobby hard the European Union. And obviously, as my position with the RPRA, it's something I led on. I was quite lucky in a lot of respects because my job before I joined the RPRA was working with the European Union on a local government level in the UK. So I knew some kind of contacts and some avenues through the European Union. But even so, it was still very difficult because it was still very political in terms of the fact that the UK had voted to leave the EU, and obviously they wanted to not make an example of it, but say example of us, but say but basically, say, look, you can't have all the benefits of being in the union and leave. And we also had to kind of get the help of the Ministerial Department of Farming and Agriculture on board to help with our lobbying. And I think it's fair to say we also had help of some French politicians, which were really supportive through contacts we'd made with the French Pigeon Federation. And something I'm very, very proud of is the fact that we managed to get those regulations changed, which meant that pigeon racing from France could continue, even though we still have to provide certain paperwork now and go through processes that previously we didn't have to go through. It's now achievable, and we've been racing again back across the continent since I think it was 2022. There was a spell after the Brexit Act in 2020, because although we left the European Union by vote, something like 2018, we didn't actually officially leave until December 2020. So I think we lost a complete racing season from across the channel in 2021. But yeah, it's something that, we managed to get over, and now people are successfully still racing from across the continent.
Wow, yeah, like you said, you were doing that for over 100 years, and then it just stopped. I mean, yeah, that's especially if it's one of the bigger races. I'm guessing being liberated at that distance as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I would say probably the largest proportion of pigeon fanciers in the UK, they keep pigeons for that type of racing. So obviously the potential impact on what was already a declining sport in the UK could have been massive, really. And we also had international races where the pigeons from the UK competing against pigeons from Holland, Belgium, and France. The Barcelona international race, all that stopped from a UK point of view. So it could have been disastrous, but with the help of a lot of people, and especially once we've got the regulations changed, there was a vet by the name of David Parsons who was very influential in helping us put the processes in place after we got the regulations changed. And also Mark Gilbert, who's a very famous pigeon fancier in the UK, was instrumental really in helping put in place structures to meet those conditions. But yeah, it's carrying on, and I think participation's down because some people are still not willing to meet that extra paperwork involved in it, but people are still enjoying it.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to do blood work and all that stuff on the loft beforehand and everything. Yeah, like you said, that sounds impossible.
Yeah, it was literally impossible. There was no way, you could move perhaps one loft of pigeons across there, but moving 10, 12, 14,000 pigeons from all across the UK across there at the time, it was just impossible.
Right. Oh, definitely a big achievement. What's the one loft racing scene like there? Is it still pretty club heavy, or are you guys getting one loft races coming up?
I think one-off racing is the only part of the sport which does seem to be increasing. And I know there's difference of opinions in terms of one-off racing. I can see the positives and negatives associated with it, but the RPRA had its own one-off race, which was really, really successful. I think they were one of the first, probably second one-off race in the UK. It's still running, but for different reasons. They moved location and lots of different things happening. Wasn't so successful this year, but the profits generated from the one-off race was what was used to fund the school project, the development officers project. That was a positive thing. But we are seeing more and more one-off rates springing up every year. I don't know exactly how many there are in the UK at the moment, but they are gaining in popularity.
Yeah, I was curious about that, being that with the history of the club racing being so strong there, how the one loft race scene was coming along. So it sounds like it's similar to here, where the one loft race is growing, and like you said, there's pros and cons to it. There's definitely an attractiveness of just being able to mail off a bird and throw your hat in the ring and see what happens.
And also people who don't keep pigeons. I mean, through my role with the RPRA, got to know a lot of people in government organisations which don't raise pigeons. But one of them in particular has set up a syndicate, and I breed them a couple of pigeons every year and send it into one of the one loft races, and they've had a little bit of success this year with them. So it's another way of introducing people to the sport. I wouldn't say one loft racing is something I'm particularly passionate about, if I'm honest with you. I prefer the more kind of traditional thing. But at the same time, some people do feel really passionate about it, and some people, it's their only way to continue in the sport. So who am I or anybody else is standing that way? I mean, it's something we should all be happy with, if as long as it's keeping people in the sport some way.
And so you're also part of the Rumney Valley, which is a local race club. What's the membership like with that club?
To be honest with you, it's declined quite a lot over recent years. I can go back probably to 2010, and we had something like, I think we at the time we had 18 lofts. And then obviously we are part of a bigger federation of clubs, which is where the racing takes place. 2019, I think we used to get about 4,500 pigeons in a race. Just in, obviously, our local club, it'd be a couple of hundred pigeons, but with all the clubs combined, we used to have about 4,500 pigeons. And they're the short races, not the national races. They're just the kind of local races organised by the clubs. We currently have 7 lofts, so you can see there again where the decline has come. But not all of those people have left the sport. They've joined other clubs, playing perhaps different routes in some occasions, or it's kind of splintered that way, really.
And since you're still racing pigeons, and we want to give advice to everybody, I'm curious to see what's your pre-race routine for when you're getting birds ready for a race.
Nothing complicated, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of information out there in terms of books, different websites, which really, in my opinion, complicate things. I'm a big fan of Ad Shellakins. from Holland. I guess you guys in the US have heard of him. He's pretty well known in the pigeon racing sport. Really successful fancier in Holland, and he has a website and writes regular articles on that website. And what strikes me is the simplicity of what he's describing in terms of looking after pigeons. Keeping things simple is my thing. So I exercise my pigeons once a day. Probably most of my competitors do it twice a day, but due to work commitments, that's just not something that's attractive to me, really. I don't want to be a slave to my pigeons. So I exercise mine once a day, usually in the evening. Get home from work about 5 o'clock, probably exercise them for about an hour. So then obviously Friday is usually basketing day, race entry day. Take them along to the local club. In terms of feeding, again, keep it really simple. They have the same mixture 365 days a year. I don't change any of the mixture. It doesn't matter if they breed in, racing, resting, molting, whatever. I'm not a believer in all these different kind of mixtures that are on the markets. I think they are just the way of manufacturers selling their product, really. I don't think you need it. I give very, very little additives apart from minerals and grit. I try to stay away from any kind of antibiotics as much as I can. Obviously, if your birds are ill and you need to, I always consult the vet first rather than treat blindly. I think the kind of abuse of antibiotics over the years has been really detrimental to the pigeon sport and the pigeons themselves. I mean, I think a lot of the modern day racing pigeons, got very poor immunity. And I don't know if it's the same in the States, but we suffer now with something called young bird sickness, which is obviously where they're holding the corn and spewing it up, etc., which is a catch-all kind of description of what is many, many different illnesses. And I think people wrongly reach for antibiotics and kind of say, "Oh, Bill who races pigeons in the next valley, give his pigeons this, so I'm going to give my pigeons this." Well, they might be suffering from totally different things.
Right.
So I think that's a huge problem in the sport and something which is not needed. I try to select my pigeons on performance and natural health, and I think that goes a long way, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, young bird sickness is a thing for sure.
Yeah, I mean, my young birds will get it every year. Every single year, my young birds will have young bird sickness. But you hear some really bad stories where people have their pigeons just dropping dead. I can say, touch wood, and quite luckily, I don't tend to suffer from that. And within 4 days, you usually see them recovering without any help from any antibiotic or anything, because the primary cause, I think every vet will agree, the primary cause is one of a couple of viruses. And what you see from the vomiting and the green diarrhea, etc., is secondary infections like E. coli. And they tend to treat the secondary infections, but not obviously with a virus. It's much harder to treat that. You can't treat that with antibiotics. So you're treating the secondary infection. So I tend to let my pigeons get over naturally. Some people say to me, "Oh, I give my pigeons this stuff. Within 7 days, they were back. They were healthy again." I said, "Well, I give my pigeons that thing, and within 7 days, they were healthy." So I don't think it is what you've given them.
Yeah, let the immune system do it because then they'll have it.
That's it. That's it.
So you've been at the top of the large combine, and you're also a member. You're an officer in your own racing club. Given the power, if you could change any one thing about where the racing situation is right now, what would you choose to do?
I think I'd force clubs, if that's the right way, to merge, because far too many small clubs, including my own. And in our area, we've got probably 3 clubs where there should be one. So I would force clubs to merge. And I would force larger national organisations to merge as well, because in the UK, we've got far too many racing organisations, especially when we go across to the continent. Into France to race. There's far too many going over there, and there's an ever decreasing pot pigeons and pigeon fanciers. And I think we need to work together rather than compete against each other in that respect.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, join together, be stronger that way too, and yeah, bigger liberations and
yeah, I think it's something they do very well on the continent, and perhaps something in terms of Holland, Belgium, maybe in France. And it's something which is perhaps a big weakness in the UK, really. And again, I think that goes back to the history of it all, how it was set up and how it's evolved. But I really do think that we need to be encouraging rather than forcing, I suppose, is the better description, organisations to join together, really, to make it stronger and also increase the competition,
right.
so a stronger competition as well.
All right. Well, we are coming up against the clock, but I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us. You brought up a lot of good points. I really like the idea of really pushing the lofts in the schools. I guess, with that right there, having a loft in a school, you're getting them at that young age if they're not naturally exposed to it from family members. And, boy, once you get that pigeon bug, it can really stick with a person.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, and also as well, you're probably likely to create members of the community who are not opposed to pigeon racing and a pigeon loft springing up next door to them,
Right.
which is something we've experienced in the UK because they're aware of what's involved and they're aware of what these birds are capable of and how they're looked after. It helps dispel some of those myths around pigeons as well, and you know them as being dirty, disease carrying birds. You know.
Absolutely. Well, Ian, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the All About Pigeons podcast. Please help the pigeon hobby by telling your fellow club members or other pigeon friends about the podcast, and make sure to leave a good review or at least a 5-star for the podcast wherever you listen. If you have a topic or a person you want to hear more about on the podcast, or if you yourself would like to be a guest, just send an email to allaboutpigeonspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.